Welcome to part 2 of this week's PowerPoint on feminist theories of crime. Traditional criminology theories, as described in the previous part of this lecture, largely ignore women's offending. Feminist criminology, therefore, looks at the question of which theories can be generalized to explain women's offending. And also wants to look at the larger extent, or the larger question, which is to what extent can criminology theories explain the gendered nature of crime, or the fact that crime is generally a male phenomenon. So this PowerPoint examines some of the explanations for why women's crime rates are low and why men's crime rates are relatively high. That's one of the key questions we'll look at, the different perspectives regarding. If we start looking at the history of feminist criminology, there are numerous branches of feminist criminology. Initial feminist writings in criminology were critiques of traditional criminology, for ignoring or distorting a number of topics related to female offenders. In addition, most traditional criminology theories were gender neutral, in that they were thought to apply equally to women and men. They actually just didn't consider gender at all because they were based on the behavior of men and were just applied to women. These theories ignored the socially constructed relationships between men and women that are associated with the concepts of masculinity and femininity. Consequently, the theories were largely unable to explain the gendered nature of crimes, so in large part that men commit the vast majority of crime. When the theories did address the gendered nature of crime, they tended to focus on the supposed characteristics that implied the women were inferior and that tended to reinforce women's subordination. Traditional criminology theories also failed to address the differences in the ways women, as opposed to men, were treated by the criminal justice system. For example, women who were accused of sex crimes were treated more harshly than were men who were accused of sex crimes. But women who were accused of violent crimes were often treated far more leniently than men. Two of the most famous early feminist criminologists were Freda Adler and Rita James Simon. Adler argued that women who were becoming more aggressive and competitive as they moved out of traditional household roles and into the male world of the workplace were more likely to commit crime. And Rita James Simon published Women in Crime, which was one of the first epigraphs that looked at women's involvement in crime. She argued that it was not because women were taking on masculine characteristics due to going to work that they were committing crime, but it was rather that as they were leaving the house more often because they were going to work, they encountered more opportunities to commit crime, especially economic and white-collar crimes, which required access to other people's money and positions of trust, which they did not have before as homemakers. Both Adler's and Simon's theories argued that liberation from traditional roles would increase the crimes that women committed. The major difference between the two had to do with the prediction about the type of crimes that females would commit. Adler's theory suggested that a large portion of the crimes would be violent, whereas Simon's theory suggested that most of the crimes would be white-collar. In research since the 1970s, most studies have shown that Simon's opportunity thesis was more valid, Unfortunately, there were others who noted that these theories generated enormous interest among non-feminist criminologists, and in some ways they set back the idea of feminist criminology because they, quote, diverted attention from the material and structural forces that shaped women's lives and experiences, unquote. Because of this, other feminist criminologists argue that neither theory should be described as feminist criminology because they weren't really advocating for women. After Adler's and Simon's contributions, writings in criminology that focused on explaining women's participation in crime increased exponentially. At first, many feminist writings in criminology could be described as part of traditional criminology itself, because they filled gaps and corrected distortions of the past. As such, they were part of what many term liberal feminism. Later, several strands of critical feminism arose that directly challenged the social structures within which liberal feminism operated. These structures looked at much more fundamental questions of how women had come to occupy subservient roles in society and how societies themselves might be transformed. The first such strand was known as radical feminism, and its central concept was that of patriarchy, usually a concept that sociologists used to describe social relationships under feudalism, whereas men dominated women in the family and in personal situations. Marxist feminists combined radical feminism with traditional Marxism to argue that the root of male dominance lied in men's ownership and control of the means of economic production. Marxist feminist criminologists argue that the actions that threaten the capitalist patriarchal system are defined as crimes by the law and by the criminal justice system. Thus, women's actions that threaten male economic dominance are defined as property crimes, and women's actions that threaten male control over women's bodies and sexuality were defined as sexual offenses. Finally, socialist feminists retained the focus on social roles and economic production, but they moved away from a rigid Marxist framework. Instead, they argued that natural reproductive differences between the sexes was what underlie male-female relationships. Authors tried to consider some of the most important topics in criminology and how they related to women in particular. Smart discussed how discourse was used to set certain women apart as quote-unquote criminal women, whereas Wonders argued that both postmodern feminism and feminism questioned the nature of justice as one that sought the quote-unquote truth, but was really an opinion of others, or opinion of some that benefited the elite, typically at the expense of others or specifically the poor. Other feminists have criticized this belief. Chesney, Lynn, and Faith questioned whether it would be useful to women to dispute the notion of truth just at the point where women were gaining a voice in the knowledge production process, i.e. they questioned whether or not people should question whether a postmodern approach to studying crime is good for women, just when women were gaining the respect necessary to be part of the society that, or the elites that determined what is the truth or what is knowledge, and produced that knowledge, and were part of the system that, in the case of the criminal justice system, were in positions of power to have discretion to determine whether or not a law was broken, were policymakers and could help write the laws. Why would you then pursue a postmodern approach that invalidates the legitimacy of law and the legitimacy of truth? Still others appeared to reject postmodernism in particular because they advocated feminist theory and research that adhered to standards of scientific objectivity. Many feminists now take what is called appreciative relativism, which is a stance within feminism that is similar to postmodernism. That is to say that they recognize and appreciate many different feminist voices as legitimate, and they refrain from analyzing, classifying, and ultimately picking apart those different voices. Earlier feminism was wrought with many divisions within it. It was dominated by middle-class European American women, and it tended to consequently ignore the different experiences of, for instance, African American women. Within criminology, gender has usually been addressed in one of two ways. First is the generalizability problem that focuses on whether traditional criminology theories, which were formulated to explain male behavior, as I previously mentioned, can be generalized to explain female criminal behavior. The second focus is the gender ratio problem on explaining why women commit far less crimes or far fewer crimes than men. While generalizability is considered the safer problem to investigate, the problem that has been of more interest is the second one, the gender ratio problem, or explaining why men commit more crimes than women. Women criminologists who focus on the gender ratio problem as opposed to the generalizability problem have been more likely to utilize observations and interviews in their research and, quote, have displayed more tentativeness and a discomfort with making global claims, unquote, at the theoretical level. In contrast, the male criminologists who address the gender ratio problem have been bolder in making grand theoretical claims and have tended to do empirical research or that has involved statistical analysis. The problem for women criminologists is that global and grand theoretical arguments are the ones that the profession values most, and the profession also values data analysis more than it values qualitative methodology. Thus, many women criminologists have complained that their research has been trivialized as case studies or has been written off as not being theoretical enough. It also means that if that happens, these voices are forced out of academia and forced out of writing and publishing and researching. Researchers have argued that gender must become a central concept in criminology theories. Social class has been the main concept in most criminology theories throughout the existence of the profession. Yet many criminologists argue that there's no relationship between class and crime, and we've been testing this for several decades on many different populations in many different countries, and we have found very few relationships between class and crime. In contrast, the relationship between gender and crime is very strong and undeniable. So there's the argument that criminologists have to theorize gender in their theories of crime. Their theories of crime must explain why men are more likely to commit crime in order for these theories to be valid. It also means that both men and women's experiences as offenders and victims, as well as their divergent treatment in the criminal justice system, can only be fully understood in the context of the sex-gender system that exists within societies. Feminist criminology has raised a wide number of issues that are related to women as offenders, women as victims, women's experiences within the criminal justice system, and all of these issues have implications for the existing criminological knowledge about men, too. However, most of the rest of this lecture is going to consider the gender ratio problem. For most of the 20th century, explanations of the gender ratio problem has focused on why women's crime rates are so low. But that approach assumes that male crime rates are the norms, and it attempts to explain why women's crime rates are so different from that norm. The opposite question, why are men's crime rates so high, is also a valid one and is also valid. In the first half of the 20th century, theories generally explained all crime in terms of biological and psychological disorders. By the 1950s, theories of men's criminality had turned to social explanations, such as ecology, strain, differential association, control, and labeling theories that were discussed earlier. Only with the rise of feminism in the 1960s and 1970s was women's criminality viewed as an entirely separate issue and was considered in relation to women's social circumstances. When we started studying women in crime, we started to think of many different perspectives on why women and men's crime rates differed. One of these perspectives said that females were more controlled than males, so they committed less crime. And this was particularly true in terms of direct controls, such as when they were under surveillance or when they were under supervision. An alternate perspective was that females exhibited less crime because they were over-controlled by their patriarchal families, because their fathers had more power than their mothers, because the father was employed and the mother wasn't. Finally, there was the thought that males and females tended to face different types of strain, and male strains were more likely to be tied to crime than female strains. Last but not least, there was the idea that women had found themselves, or at least some women, learned to be criminals by finding themselves in a situation where their aunts, cousins, siblings, mothers, routinely engaged in crime, and that the women learned from these individuals. Some feminists looked at female criminality in the context of doing gender, an approach to gender that assumed that female gender roles was something that had to be accomplished given the social circumstances of a certain place. This is also to note that female gender roles can be dysfunctional in certain ways, but that the greater problem lies in overconformity to roles in sexist societies. This was looked at in many different situations, such as drug markets in Brooklyn, armed robberies in St. Louis, and girls who were involved in gangs. Many have noted that women's, or the focus on of feminist criminologists has meant that the profession has changed so that it's not just, oh, women are so different than men, or women's crime rates are less, but has meant that men's gender has to be acknowledged by the profession, and that male behavior is no longer just the norm. There are some traditional criminology theories that propose causal factors that are unequally distributed by genders. For example, testosterone levels, which was a biological factor that we discussed in the early weeks of the class that can be associated with crime, is much more concentrated in men than in women. Some criminologists have argued that the profession is unwilling to accept that male violence flows from a combination of genes, chemicals, and environment. A different perspective says that women suffer, or women commit less crime because there's different uses of aggression in girls and boys. This research says that while boys and girls differ little in their use of physical aggression in infancy, a gap widens over their lives, peaking between the ages of like 18 and 30. And this gap means that it looks like women have the greater ability to regulate and inhibit their aggressive behavior. Finally, Gottfredson and Hirsch's theory says that boys may be allowed to have lower self-control mechanisms than girls, and thus girls are more likely to have high self-control and stable personalities in adolescence and adulthood.